The dust on Juliana Armstrong's boots had turned from the reddish-brown of mountain soil to the pale gray of valley earth by the time she reached the outskirts of Park City, Utah, and she wondered if her father would have approved of her leaving the hills where their family had scratched out a living for 3 generations. September 1878 had brought an unusual warmth to the territory, and the sun beat down on her shoulders as she descended the final slope toward the sprawling mining town that had grown fat on silver strikes and desperate dreams. She carried everything she owned in a leather satchel her mother had stitched before the consumption took her 2 winters past, and in her pocket rested the last $20 from selling their claim to a consortium from back east who saw profit where she saw only memories of her father's broken back and empty promises. The town sprawled before her like a living thing, all wooden buildings and churned mud streets, the sound of hammers and voices rising up to meet her as she walked down what someone had optimistically named Main Street. Juliana had turned 19 the month before, alone in the cabin that creaked and groaned like an old man's bones, and she had decided that morning while eating the last of her flour as plain johnnycakes that staying in those hills would mean dying in those hills, same as her parents. The mining life had taken her father's lungs, her mother's strength, and very nearly her own hope, but she had enough left to point her feet downward and see what the flat land might offer. She passed the assay office, the general store with its painted sign promising goods from San Francisco, and 3 separate saloons before she reached the livery stable, where a man stood brushing down a sorrel mare with the kind of attention most men reserved for their wives or their whiskey. He looked up as her shadow fell across the threshold, and Juliana found herself meeting eyes the color of summer sky, set in a face that had seen weather and work but not yet cruelty. "Help you, miss." His voice carried the slow drawl of someone who had learned English from Texans, and he straightened to his full height, which put him a head taller than her own 5.5 feet. "Looking for work," Juliana said, keeping her voice steady though her legs ached from the 6-hour walk down from the mining camp. "Can do most anything that needs doing. Can read and cipher, work with animals, cook, clean, mend." The man set down his brush and walked toward her with the rolling gait of someone who spent more time in a saddle than on his own feet. Up close, she could see he was perhaps 25, with dark hair that curled at his collar and hands that bore the calluses of real labor. His shirt had been mended at the shoulder with stitches too neat to be his own work, and his boots, though dusty, showed good leather and better care. "Yates Granger," he said, extending one of those calloused hands. "I run cattle for the Anderson spread about 8 miles west of here. Come into town to pick up a horse old man Patterson wanted reshod." He looked her over with an expression that seemed more curious than calculating. "You coming down from the mining camps, Juliana Armstrong? My father had a claim up in the hills, silver mostly, or the hope of silver anyway." She shook his hand, noting the firm grip that neither crushed nor condescended. "He died in March. I have been working it alone since then, but the vein played out and I sold what was left." Yates nodded slowly, his gaze traveling to her boots and back up to her face. "Hard life up there. Seen men come down from those camps looking like they aged 20 years in 5. Hard enough." Juliana shifted her satchel to her other shoulder. "But I am done with hills and holes in the ground. Rather work where I can see the horizon." Something shifted in Yates's expression, a warmth creeping into those blue eyes like sunshine through morning clouds. "You belong on flat land, I would say. Hills are no place for someone who has not been broken by them yet." He glanced back at the mare, then returned his attention to Juliana. "As it happens, the Anderson ranch needs someone to help with the household. Mrs. Anderson has been managing on her own since her daughter married and moved to Salt Lake City, and Mr. Anderson has been after me to find someone suitable. You interested in ranch work? What would it entail?" Juliana kept her tone businesslike, though relief bloomed in her chest like a wildflower after rain. "Cooking for the household and the hands, that is about 12 men total during busy seasons. Mending, cleaning, helping Mrs. Anderson with the kitchen garden. Room and board included, plus $30 a month." Yates crossed his arms, and Juliana caught the faint scent of leather and sage. "The Andersons are fair people. They will work you hard but treat you decent." $30 a month represented more cash money than Juliana had seen in 6 months of breaking rocks and hoping for color. She nodded once, decisive. "When can I start?" "Soon as I finish with this mare and you are ready to ride. I brought the wagon in, so there is room for you and your things." Yates smiled then, a slow spreading expression that transformed his serious face into something approaching beautiful. "Welcome to the flat lands, Miss Armstrong." The ride out to the Anderson ranch took them through country that opened Juliana's chest in ways she had not expected. After years of being hemmed in by mountains and trees, the rolling grasslands stretched away in every direction, painted golden by the afternoon sun. Yates drove the wagon with casual competence, the reins loose in his hands as the 2 horses pulling them found their own pace. "How long have you worked for the Andersons?" Juliana asked, watching the way the wind made patterns in the grass like water flowing over stones. "Going on 7 years now. Came up from Texas with a trail drive when I was 18, decided Utah suited me better than going back south." Yates glanced at her, then returned his attention to the horses. "Mr. Anderson gave me a chance when I was green as spring grass, taught me the cattle business proper. I owe him more than I can repay." "Loyalty is worth something," Juliana said. "My father always said a man's word was the only currency that did not depreciate." "Sounds like a good man." "He was, just unlucky." Juliana watched a hawk circle overhead, riding thermals invisible to earthbound eyes. "Spent 20 years looking for the big strike that would change everything. Found enough to keep hoping but never enough to stop digging." Yates was quiet for a moment, the wagon wheels creaking over the packed earth road. "I knew men like that in Texas, always chasing the next thing, the better thing, never seeing what they had right in front of them." He adjusted his hat against the slanting sunlight. "Me, I figure the best fortune is in knowing when you have got enough and being grateful for it." Juliana studied his profile, the strong nose and firm jaw, the way his hands held the reins with gentle authority. "That is an unusual philosophy for a young man." "Maybe," Yates smiled slightly. "Or maybe I just saw what happened to the ones who never stopped wanting more. They ended up with less than nothing and no one to care when they were gone." He turned to look at her directly. "You strike me as someone who knows the difference between dreams and foolishness." "I am learning it," Juliana admitted, though coming down from those hills felt like admitting defeat. "No defeat in choosing life over stubbornness," Yates said firmly. "That took more courage than staying would have." The words settled something in Juliana's chest, some tight knot of shame she had been carrying since she walked away from her father's claim. She found herself smiling at this cowboy who spoke like a philosopher and drove his wagon like a man completely at home in his own skin. The Anderson Ranch appeared as a collection of buildings clustered around a large main house built from logs and stone. Corrals spread out behind the house, holding horses in various states of readiness, and beyond them, Juliana could see cattle dotting the grassland like dark punctuation marks. A woman emerged from the main house as the wagon approached, wiping her hands on her apron, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun that suggested military precision. "That is Mrs. Anderson," Yates said, pulling the horses to a stop. Do not let the stern face fool you. She has got a heart soft as butter, but she runs a tight household. Mrs. Anderson proved to be exactly as advertised, sharp-eyed, direct in speech, but with an underlying kindness that showed in the way she insisted Juliana sit and have coffee before even discussing the position. The kitchen smelled of bread and beans, and Juliana felt something in her relax as she sank into a chair at the scarred wooden table that dominated the room. "Yates tells me you have been working your father's claim alone," Mrs. Anderson said, pouring coffee from a blue enamel pot. "That shows grit, but grit alone does not make for good household help. Can you actually cook, or did Yates hire you for your pretty face, Margaret?" Yates protested, but he was grinning. "I can cook plain food well and fancy food adequately," Juliana said, meeting the older woman's gaze steadily. "I can make bread that does not break teeth, stew that does not taste like dishwater, and pie crust that my father said was the one thing that made winter bearable. I can also slaughter and dress a chicken, milk a cow, and make soap from tallow. What I do not know, I can learn if someone will teach me." Mrs. Anderson's severe expression cracked into a smile. "Honest, at least. I appreciate that more than false confidence." She sat down across from Juliana with her own cup of coffee. "The work is hard, and the hours are long. We feed 12 men 3 meals a day during spring and fall when the work is heaviest, 8 during winter. You will have Sunday afternoons off and 1 full day per month to go into town if you wish. Room is in the house, a small bedroom off the kitchen. $30 a month, paid on the first. You will eat with the family, not with the hands. We expect honesty, hard work, and clean living. No entertaining men in your room, no drinking to excess, and no gambling. Fair, more than fair, madam." Juliana extended her hand across the table. "You have got yourself a worker." The work proved every bit as demanding as Mrs. Anderson had promised. Juliana rose at 4:30 each morning to start fires in both the kitchen stove and the larger range in the cookhouse, where the hands took their meals. By 5, she had coffee boiling and biscuits in the oven, and by 5:30, she was frying eggs and salt pork in quantities that would have fed her father for a week. The ranch hands filed through at 6, collecting plates and disappearing back to their work, and Juliana barely had time to clean up breakfast before starting preparations for the midday meal. But the work had a rhythm to it, a predictability that Juliana found soothing after years of the mining camp's boom and bust uncertainty. Mrs. Anderson proved to be a patient teacher, showing Juliana how to make the light, fluffy biscuits the men preferred, and how to stretch a beef roast with vegetables and gravy so that it fed more mouths without anyone feeling cheated. Mr. Anderson, a quiet man with kind eyes and an impressive mustache, mostly stayed out of the kitchen's domain but always thanked Juliana for her work when their paths crossed. And then there was Yates, who seemed to find more reasons to visit the main house than Juliana suspected were strictly necessary. He would appear in the kitchen doorway after breakfast, asking if Mrs. Anderson needed anything from the barn or offering to carry heavy pots. He would linger over coffee at midday, telling stories about the cattle or the other hands that made even Mrs. Anderson laugh. And in the evenings, after supper was cleared and the kitchen cleaned, he would sometimes sit on the porch steps while Juliana shelled peas or peeled potatoes for the next day, talking about everything and nothing while the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. "You settling in all right?" he asked one evening 2 weeks after Juliana's arrival. He had positioned himself on the step below where she sat with a basin of green beans that needed trimming, and he had rolled a cigarette but had not yet lit it, just turned it between his fingers like a talisman. "Better than all right," Juliana said truthfully. I forgot what it felt like to go to bed without worrying about whether I would have food for the next day. Good. Yates finally lit the cigarette, cupping the match against the evening breeze. You are fitting in well. The men like your cooking, which is high praise considering they complained about old Cookie Thompson for 5 straight years before he retired. Mrs. Anderson says I need to work on my pie crust, Juliana said, snapping the ends off a bean with more force than necessary. Apparently it is still too heavy. Tasted fine to me, Yates offered, but then I am not much of a judge. Everything tastes good when you have been eating trail dust for 12 hours. Juliana smiled despite herself. That is not the compliment you think it is. Fair enough. Yates took a long drag on his cigarette, then exhaled slowly. What I meant to say is that you have got a gift for making food taste like someone cares about the eating of it, if that makes sense. It is not just fuel, it is comfort. The unexpected poetry of the statement made Juliana look up from her beans. Yates was staring out at the horizon where the sun was melting into the grasslands, his profile sharp against the golden light. She felt something shift in her chest, a recognition she was not quite ready to name. That is a kind thing to say, she managed. Just the truth. Yates turned to look at her then, and the expression in his blue eyes made Juliana's hand still on the beans. You have got a way about you, Juliana Armstrong, like you have been through the fire but did not let it make you hard. Some days I feel plenty hard, Juliana said, trying to keep her tone light though her heart had started beating faster. Some days I feel like I am made of nothing but sharp edges and stubbornness. Then you hide it well. Yates stood up, flicking the cigarette away into the dirt. I should let you finish your work, just wanted to make sure you were doing all right. I am, Juliana said. Thanks to you mostly. You did not have to offer me this job. Sure I did. Yates smiled down at her. Told you the first day you belong on flat land. Would have been a crime to let you waste away in those hills. He walked away before Juliana could respond, his boots crunching on the gravel path that led to the bunkhouse. She watched him go, her hands forgotten in the basin of beans, and tried to ignore the way her pulse had not yet returned to normal. The autumn work intensified as October arrived, bringing cooler nights and the urgent need to prepare for winter. The cattle had to be moved to lower pastures, fences needed mending, and the harvest from the kitchen garden required processing into preserves and pickles that would see the household through until spring. Juliana worked from before dawn until well after dark, but she found she did not mind the exhaustion that dragged her into dreamless sleep each night. What she minded was the growing awareness of Yates Granger that seemed to occupy more and more of her thoughts. She noticed things she had no business noticing. The way his shirt pulled across his shoulders when he lifted heavy sacks of grain, the sound of his laugh carrying across the yard, the gentleness with which he handled nervous horses. She caught herself watching for him at mealtimes, listening for his voice among the other hands, finding excuses to be working on the porch when she knew he would be returning from the pastures. Mrs. Anderson noticed, of course. The woman missed nothing that happened under her roof. He is a good man, she said one afternoon while she and Juliana were putting up tomatoes, the kitchen steamy and fragrant with cooking fruit. Yates, I mean, in case you were wondering. Juliana felt heat rise to her face that had nothing to do with the boiling water bath. I was not wondering anything in particular. Of course not. Mrs. Anderson smiled, a knowing expression that made Juliana feel transparent as glass, and he has not been finding 3 times as many excuses to come to the main house since you arrived. I had not noticed, Juliana lied. Child, I may be old, but I am not blind. Mrs. Anderson ladled tomatoes into another jar with practiced efficiency. There is nothing wrong with noticing a good man, especially one who clearly notices you right back. Just be careful. Ranch romances can get complicated when people work and live in close quarters. There is no romance, Juliana protested, but even to her own ears the words sounded half-hearted. Not yet, Mrs. Anderson agreed, but there could be, if you both stopped dancing around it like spooked horses. Before Juliana could formulate a response, the kitchen door swung open to admit Mr. Anderson, followed by Yates and two of the other hands. They looked grim, and Mr. Anderson's face wore the expression of a man delivering bad news. "We have got trouble," he said without preamble. "Found tracks up by Willow Creek, mountain lion, and a big one by the looks of it. Already took down one of the yearling calves." Juliana felt her stomach tighten. She had grown up hearing stories about mountain lions, the damage they could do to livestock and, occasionally, to people who got between them and their prey. How fresh were the tracks? Mrs. Anderson asked, already moving into the practical response that Juliana had learned characterized the woman's approach to crisis. "This morning, we figure, we are going to need to organize a hunt before it gets comfortable raiding our stock." Mr. Anderson looked at Yates. "I want you to lead it. Take 4 men and enough supplies for 3 days. Start at Willow Creek and track it into the high country if you need to." Yates nodded, his jaw set. "We will head out at first light, should have enough moon to track by if it stays clear." Something cold and unwelcome unfurled in Juliana's chest at the thought of Yates heading into the mountains after a predator. She kept her expression neutral, but her hands had clenched on the spoon she was holding. "I will pack provisions for 6 men, 3 days, she said, her voice steady. "Dried beef, hardtack, beans, coffee. Will you be able to make fires or do you need cold food?" "We will manage fires," Yates said, and his eyes found hers across the kitchen. Something passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that felt intimate despite the presence of the others. "Nothing fancy needed. Just fuel to keep us going." "You will have it," Juliana promised. She worked late into the night preparing supplies for the hunting party, wrapping dried beef in oilcloth, measuring out coffee and beans into individual sacks, baking hardtack that would last without spoiling. Mrs. Anderson helped for a while, then retired with a meaningful look that suggested Juliana's dedication might involve more than professional duty. Juliana ignored the implication and kept working. She was wrapping the last of the supplies when Yates appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had clearly come from the bunkhouse, dressed for sleep in a simple cotton shirt and work pants, his hair damp from washing. "You should not have stayed up so late," he said, moving into the room with that easy grace she had come to recognize. "We would have managed with whatever you put together tomorrow. I wanted to make sure you had what you needed." Juliana tied off the bundle and added it to the pile on the table. "Mountain lions are nothing to take lightly." "I have hunted them before," Yates said, but his tone was gentle. "Down in Texas, they called them painters. Dangerous, sure, but respectful of men with guns and good sense. Still." Juliana found she could not finish the sentence, could not articulate the fear that had been building in her chest since Mr. Anderson announced the hunt. Yates closed the distance between them, stopping just near enough that Juliana could feel the warmth radiating from him. "I will be careful," he said quietly. "I promise you that." "Why would you promise me?" Juliana asked, though she thought she knew the answer. "Because I think you might care if I was not," Yates said, and there was no teasing in his voice, just honesty. "Same way I would care if you were the one heading into danger." Juliana looked up at him, meeting those blue eyes that had haunted her thoughts for weeks. "I would care," she admitted. "More than I probably should, given I have only known you 2 months. Time does not matter much when the connection is right," Yates said. He lifted one hand and tucked a strand of hair behind Juliana's ear, the gesture so tender that it made her throat tight. "I have known you were special since the day you walked into town looking like you were ready to take on the world with nothing but determination and a leather satchel." "I was terrified," Juliana confessed. "I know, but you did it anyway." Yates's hand lingered near her face, not quite touching but close enough that Juliana could feel the possibility of it. That is what made it brave. They stood there in the lamp-lit kitchen, the rest of the household sleeping around them, and Juliana felt the last of her resistance crumble. She leaned into Yates's touch, letting her eyes close for just a moment, allowing herself the luxury of comfort. "Come back safe," she whispered. "I will," Yates promised. "I have got too much waiting for me here to do otherwise." He left before Juliana could respond, slipping back into the night like a shadow. She stood alone in the kitchen, her heart pounding, and acknowledged what she had been avoiding for weeks. She was falling in love with Yates Granger, and the thought terrified her almost as much as it thrilled her. The hunting party departed at dawn. 6 men on horseback with rifles and the provisions Juliana had prepared. She watched from the kitchen window as they rode out, Yates in the lead on his sorrel mare, and tried not to imagine all the things that could go wrong when men went hunting animals that could hunt them back. The days without Yates crawled by like wounded things. Juliana threw herself into work, baking bread until her arms ached, scrubbing floors that did not need scrubbing, and generally making Mrs. Anderson eye her with a combination of sympathy and amusement. The other hands noticed Yates's absence too. The meals were quieter without his stories, the whole ranch feeling slightly diminished by the loss of his steady presence. On the evening of the 3rd day, just as Juliana was beginning to imagine increasingly dire scenarios, the hunting party returned. She heard the commotion from the kitchen and rushed outside, not caring that she still wore her flour-dusted apron or that her hair had come loose from its pins. Yates was dismounting, dirty and tired but gloriously whole, and when he saw her, his face split into a grin that made her knees weak. "We got it," he called out. "Big Tom must have weighed near 200 pounds. He will not be bothering the cattle anymore." Juliana wanted to run to him, to throw her arms around him and confirm that he was really back and really safe, but propriety and the presence of a dozen observers kept her rooted to the porch. She settled for a smile that she knew revealed too much of what she felt. "I will start heating water for baths," she said, her voice catching slightly. "And there is stew keeping warm if you are hungry." "Starving," Yates said, but he was looking at her, not the kitchen, and the hunger in his eyes had nothing to do with food. Later, after the men had eaten and bathed and dispersed to their various sleeping quarters, Yates found Juliana on the porch where she had taken to shelling beans during their previous conversations. The night was cold enough that she had wrapped herself in a shawl, and the stars overhead looked close enough to touch. "Mind company?" Yates asked, though he was already lowering himself to sit beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "I think I would mind if you did not offer it," Juliana said honestly. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, Juliana's hands busy with the beans while Yates simply breathed beside her, the tension of the hunt slowly draining from his frame. "I thought about you," he said finally. "Up there in the mountains, cold and uncomfortable and tracking that cat through country that tried its best to break an ankle or worse. I kept thinking about your face and how I wanted to see it again." Juliana's hands stilled. "I thought about you too. Too much, probably. Mrs. Anderson caught me burning biscuits because I was staring out the window instead of watching the oven." Yates laughed, a warm sound that seemed to wrap around Juliana like a blanket. "I am sorry I made you burn biscuits. That seems like a serious crime in this household." It is, Juliana agreed, smiling despite the emotion building in her chest. But I would burn 1,000 batches if it meant you came home safe. Juliana. Yates turned to face her fully, taking the basin of beans and setting it aside. He captured her hands in his, and his calloused palms felt warm and solid against her work-roughened fingers. I need you to know something. I am not a man prone to fancy words or grand gestures, but I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. These past 2 months since you came down from those hills have been the best of my life, and that is entirely because of you. Yates, Juliana whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. Let me finish, he said gently. I know it is fast, and I know you have got your own plans for your life. But if you are willing, I would like to see where this goes between us. Properly, I mean. With intention and honesty and all the things that matter when people care about each other. You mean courting, Juliana said, wanting to be clear. I mean courting, Yates confirmed, with the ultimate goal of seeing if we suit each other for the long term, for marriage and partnership and building a life together. Juliana felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, relief and joy mixing with something deeper. I am not the easiest person, she warned. I am stubborn and opinionated, and I have got scars from watching my parents kill themselves for dreams that never came true. I am not looking for easy, Yates said. I am looking for real, and you are the most real person I have ever met. Then yes, Juliana said, squeezing his hands. Yes, I would like that very much. Yates pulled her into his arms, and Juliana went willingly, resting her head against his chest where she could hear the steady thump of his heart. They held each other on the porch while the stars wheeled overhead, and the night settled around them like a blessing. And Juliana thought that perhaps coming down from the hills had been the best decision she had ever made. The courting proceeded with a formality that amused Juliana even as she appreciated Yates's respect for propriety. He asked Mr. Anderson's permission, which was granted with a knowing smile. He began joining Juliana for Sunday afternoon walks into Park City, where they would browse the general store or simply stroll the streets while Yates pointed out the changes that had occurred since he first arrived in town. He brought her small gifts, a hair ribbon in a blue that matched her eyes, a book of poetry he thought she might enjoy, wild flowers that he had clearly ridden out of his way to collect. But more than the gifts or the formal courtship rituals, what Juliana treasured were the conversations. Yates talked about his childhood in Texas, about a father who drank and a mother who had died when he was 12, leaving him to raise himself on the streets of San Antonio before he lied about his age to join a trail drive north. Juliana told him about the mining camps, about watching her father's hope dim year by year while her mother grew thinner and quieter until she simply faded away. "Do you ever regret leaving the hills?" Yates asked one Sunday as they sat beside the creek that ran through town, watching the water flow over smooth stones. "No," Juliana said without hesitation. "I regret that my parents died there, and I regret that I could not save them. But leaving was the only way to save myself, and I do not think they would have wanted me to stay out of misplaced loyalty. Your father sounds like he was a wise man, underneath the gold fever. He was. He just wanted something better for us, and he thought metal in the ground was the way to get it." Juliana picked up a pebble and tossed it into the creek, watching the ripples spread. What he did not realize was that better was not about wealth. It was about having enough and being content with it. "Like I said that first day in the wagon," Yates reminded her, "knowing when you have got enough." "Exactly." Juliana turned to look at him, this cowboy who had somehow become the center of her world in just a few short months. "I have enough right now in this moment. More than enough, actually." Yates leaned over and kissed her then, a soft press of lips that tasted of coffee and promise. It was not their first kiss, but still new enough that Juliana felt it all the way to her toes, a warmth that had nothing to do with the autumn sunshine. "I love you," Yates said when they separated, his forehead resting against hers. "I know it is soon, but I have never been more sure of anything." "I love you too," Juliana whispered back, the words feeling both terrifying and completely right. "I think I have loved you since you told me I belonged on flat land." "Best thing I ever said," Yates murmured, pulling her close. "Best thing I ever did was convince you to come work at the ranch." They sat by the creek until the sun began to sink toward the horizon, wrapped in each other's arms and the certainty of what they had found together. When they finally returned to the ranch, Mrs. Anderson took one look at their faces and smiled in a way that suggested she had been expecting this development all along. Winter came to Utah with snow that turned the grasslands into a white ocean, and the rhythm of the ranch shifted to match the season. The cattle had been brought down to the winter pastures closer to the main buildings, and the work focused on maintenance and survival rather than the urgent push of spring and fall. Juliana spent more time indoors, cooking hearty meals that fought back against the cold and mending clothes by the fire, while Mrs. Anderson read aloud from the newspapers that arrived weekly from Salt Lake City. Yates spent his days checking on the cattle, breaking ice on water troughs, and ensuring the horses stayed healthy through the cold months. But he still found time each evening to visit the main house, sitting with Juliana by the fire and planning a future that grew more solid with each passing week. "I have been thinking," he said one evening in late December, with Christmas just days away. "Mr. Anderson has offered me a section of land on the eastern edge of the property. Says if I want to start building a place of my own, he would sell it to me for a fair price and let me pay it off over time." Juliana's heart kicked in her chest. "That is generous of him." "It is. He has been good to me from the start." Yates reached over and took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "I am thinking it might be time to start building, if you were willing to help me plan what that place might look like." "You mean plan a house," Juliana said carefully. "I mean plan a home," Yates corrected. "For two people and hopefully a family someday down the road." "That sounds like a proposal, Yates Granger." "Not yet." Yates smiled, that slow, spreading expression that transformed his face. "When I propose proper, you will know it. This is just me making sure we are thinking along the same lines before I spend my savings on lumber and nails." "We are thinking along the same lines," Juliana assured him, squeezing his hand. "Very much along the same lines." The actual proposal came on Christmas Eve, after the household had finished a supper of roasted chicken and the dried apple pie that Juliana had finally perfected to Mrs. Anderson's exacting standards. Yates asked Juliana to bundle up and step outside with him, claiming he wanted to show her how the stars looked over fresh snow. They walked away from the main house toward the corral, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air, and Yates stopped where they could see the whole sweep of the sky unobstructed by buildings or trees. The stars blazed overhead, brittle and beautiful, and the snow reflected their light until the whole world seemed to glow. "Juliana Armstrong," Yates said, turning to face her and taking both her hands in his. "I am not a rich man, and I cannot promise you an easy life. But I can promise you that I will work every day to make you happy, to build something solid and lasting with you. I can promise you loyalty and partnership, and love that will not fade just because times get hard." He pulled a small box from his coat pocket, opening it to reveal a simple gold band with a single small diamond that caught the starlight. "Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you?" Juliana felt tears freeze on her cheeks as they fell, but she was smiling so hard her face ached. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, absolutely yes." Yates slipped the ring onto her finger, and then he was kissing her, his cold lips warming against hers while the snow crunched under their feet and the stars bore witness. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Juliana laughed with pure joy. "How long have you been planning this?" she asked. "Since about a week after you arrived," Yates admitted. "But I figured I should probably wait a bit before asking, make sure you were not going to run back to the hills." "No danger of that," Juliana said, looking at the ring on her finger. It was not fancy, but it was perfect, solid and real and chosen with care. "I told you, I belong on flat land. With you." They married in February 1879 on a Saturday when the weather cooperated enough to allow guests to travel from town. The ceremony took place in the small church in Park City, with Mrs. Anderson standing up as matron of honor, and Mr. Anderson giving Juliana away, since she had no family left to do so. The other ranch hands crowded into the pews along with townsfolk who had come to know Juliana through her trips to the general store, and the preacher kept the service blessedly short, understanding that people needed to start back to their homes before dark. Juliana wore a dress that Mrs. Anderson had helped her sew, a simple blue wool that brought out the color of her eyes, and she carried wild flowers that one of the hands had somehow convinced to bloom early in the ranch's small greenhouse. Yates wore his best suit, his hair slicked back and his boots polished to a shine, and when he saw Juliana walking toward him down the aisle, his face showed such open love that several women in the congregation dabbed at their eyes. The vows were traditional, promises to love and honor through good times and bad, sickness and health, until death parted them. Juliana spoke hers clearly, meeting Yates's eyes and meaning every word. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife and Yates kissed her, gentle and reverent, Juliana felt something settle in her chest that she recognized as belonging. The reception at the ranch featured more food than the gathered crowd could possibly eat, prepared by Juliana and Mrs. Anderson over the previous week. There was music from a fiddle player who worked at the livery, dancing in the barn that had been cleared and decorated with pine boughs, and enough whiskey to make everyone cheerful without getting anyone properly drunk. Juliana danced with Yates, with Mr. Anderson, with several of the ranch hands who treated her with the careful respect due a new bride, and finally with Yates again as the evening wound down and guests began departing. "Happy?" Yates asked, holding her close as they swayed to the last song of the night. "Happier than I knew I could be," Juliana said honestly. "Thank you for finding me that day in town. Thank you for telling me I belonged on flat land. Thank you for believing me," Yates said. "Thank you for taking a chance on a cowboy with more dreams than sense." "You have plenty of sense," Juliana protested. "Just enough dreams to make life interesting." They spent their wedding night in a room the Andersons had prepared for them in the main house, since the cabin Yates was building on their land section would not be ready for another month. Juliana had been nervous about this part, the intimacy that would seal their marriage in ways beyond legal documents and spoken vows. But Yates was gentle and patient, taking his time to make sure she was comfortable, and what could have been awkward became instead another form of conversation, a learning of each other's bodies and preferences that left them both breathless and amazed. "I love you, Mrs. Granger," Yates said afterward, holding Juliana against his chest while she traced lazy patterns on his skin. "I love you, Mr. Granger," Juliana replied, still getting used to her new name. "I love this life we are building. We have only just started," Yates said. "Wait until we have got our own place, our own cattle, maybe a few children running around causing chaos," That sounds perfect, Juliana murmured, letting her eyes drift closed. Absolutely perfect. The cabin took shape over the following months, growing from foundation to walls to roof as Yates and several of the other hands worked their spare hours on construction. Juliana spent her days continuing to help Mrs. Anderson while planning the details of her own household. Where the kitchen would be organized, how many windows to include for light, where a garden might be planted come spring. Mr. Anderson proved true to his word, selling them the land on generous terms and even contributing materials from the ranch stores. The other hands pitched in because they liked Yates and had come to respect Juliana, and because ranch life encouraged mutual support in the face of a harsh and unforgiving land. By May, the cabin was complete enough to move into, though finishing touches would continue for months. It was not large, 3 rooms total, with a main living area that served as kitchen and sitting room, a bedroom, and a small storage room that could eventually become a child's space. But it was solid and well made, with glass windows and a stone fireplace and a door that hung straight. On the day they moved in, Yates carried Juliana over the threshold despite her laughing protests that they were already married, and such traditions were behind them. He set her down in the middle of what would become their kitchen and kissed her thoroughly before stepping back to survey their new domain. "What do you think?" he asked, and Juliana heard the nervousness underlying the casual question. "I think it is home," she said simply. "I think it is everything I never knew I wanted." They settled into married life with the ease of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Yates still worked for Mr. Anderson, though now he was building his own small herd of cattle with the long-term goal of running an independent operation. Juliana kept her position helping Mrs. Anderson, though she also began taking and mending from townspeople who appreciated her neat stitching and fair prices. The additional income was modest but welcome as they furnished their cabin and planned for the future. Summer brought long days of work in the garden Juliana had planted, coaxing vegetables from the Utah soil while Yates worked cattle under the fierce sun. Evenings found them on the porch they had built onto the front of the cabin, watching the light fade from the sky while they talked about everything and nothing, their hands intertwined and their shoulders touching. "You ever miss the hills?" Yates asked one evening in late July when the heat had finally broken and the breeze carried the scent of sage. "Sometimes," Juliana admitted. "I miss the way sound traveled differently, bouncing off the canyon walls. I miss the particular color of the rocks when the sun hit them. But I do not miss the loneliness or the desperation, and I would not trade this life for anything." "Good," Yates said with satisfaction, "because I am rather attached to having you here beside me." "The feeling is mutual," Juliana assured him. "Though I am still adjusting to the idea that this is permanent, that I do not have to keep waiting for the other shoe to drop." "No shoes dropping," Yates promised. "Just us, building something that will last." In September, Juliana realized she had missed her monthly courses for the second time and began to suspect she might be pregnant. She waited another week to be sure before telling Yates, wanting to be certain before raising hopes that might be disappointed. But when the 3rd week passed, and the familiar signs of pregnancy began to manifest a slight nausea in the mornings, an unusual sensitivity to smells, a tenderness in her breasts, she decided it was time to share her suspicions. She told him over supper, a simple meal of fried chicken and biscuits, watching his face as she said quietly, "I think I might be expecting a child." Yates went very still, his fork halfway to his mouth. "You think or you know?" "I am fairly certain," Juliana said. "All the signs are there. I thought about going to see the doctor in town, but I wanted to tell you first." Yates set down his fork carefully, then pushed back from the table and came around to where Juliana sat. He knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "Our baby. Are you happy?" Juliana asked, suddenly nervous. They had talked about children in abstract terms, but the reality was arriving faster than she had anticipated. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Yates said, his voice rough with emotion. "You have given me everything, Juliana. A home, a purpose, love. And now this. How could I be anything but overjoyed?" Juliana felt tears prick her eyes. "I am scared," she admitted. "My mother had 2 miscarriages before she had me, and then she never carried another child to term. What if I cannot do this?" "You can do anything," Yates said firmly. "You climbed down from those hills with nothing but determination and built a whole new life. If anyone can handle pregnancy and childbirth, it is you." He placed one hand gently on her still flat stomach. "And you will not be doing it alone. I will be right here, every step of the way." The pregnancy progressed normally, though Juliana found the nausea more debilitating than she had expected. Mrs. Anderson, who had raised 3 children of her own, provided both practical advice and moral support. She showed Juliana how to make ginger tea that settled her stomach, and insisted she rest more, taking over some of the heavier kitchen work. Yates became almost comically protective, hovering until Juliana had to shoo him away so she could work. He lifted anything heavier than a plate, insisted she sit down every hour, and rode into town weekly to fetch whatever foods she found appealing. The other ranch hands teased him mercilessly about his mother hen tendencies, but Juliana found his concern touching even when it bordered on excessive. Winter arrived with Juliana 6 months pregnant and noticeably showing. She had let out her dresses twice already and resigned herself to wearing Yates's shirts around the house, the fabric stretched across her expanding belly. The baby was active, kicking and rolling in ways that fascinated Yates when he placed his hand on her stomach to feel the movement. "Strong," he said one evening, his palm pressed against where a tiny foot was pressing outward. "Just like the mother. Just like both parents," Juliana corrected. "This child has your stubbornness as much as mine." "Heaven help us all," Yates said, but he was grinning. Juliana went into labor on a cold March morning in 1880, 2 weeks before her expected delivery date. The pain started as a dull ache in her lower back and rapidly intensified into contractions that took her breath away. Yates, who had been preparing to ride out to check the cattle, took one look at her face and immediately sent one of the hands for the doctor while he helped Juliana back to their cabin. Mrs. Anderson arrived before the doctor, her sleeves already rolled up and her manner briskly competent. She examined Juliana, pronounced everything normal, and set about preparing the bedroom for the birth with the efficiency of long practice. Yates hovered until Mrs. Anderson firmly but kindly shooed him out to the main room, explaining that he could help most by staying out of the way until he was needed. The labor lasted 14 hours, and they were the longest hours of Juliana's life. Pain rolled through her in waves that seemed impossible to endure, yet somehow she endured them. Mrs. Anderson coached her through breathing, held her hand during the worst contractions, and never once suggested that Juliana was anything less than capable. When the doctor finally arrived, hours into the process, he examined her and declared everything was progressing as it should, then settled in to wait. Yates was allowed back in during the final stages, and he held Juliana's hand while she pushed, his face nearly as pale as hers but his grip steady and strong. When the baby finally emerged with a lusty cry that announced its displeasure at the cold world, Juliana collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted and exhilarated. "It is a boy," the doctor announced, handing the squalling infant to Mrs. Anderson for cleaning. A healthy boy, from the sound of those lungs. Juliana felt tears stream down her face as Mrs. Anderson wrapped the baby in clean blankets and placed him in her arms. He was red-faced and angry, his tiny fists waving, but to Juliana, he was perfect. She looked up at Yates, who was staring at their son with an expression of awe, and saw tears tracking down his face as well. "We have a son," she whispered. "We have a son," Yates echoed. He reached out one finger to stroke the baby's cheek, his touch infinitely gentle. "He is perfect." "You are perfect." They named him Thomas Henry Granger, Thomas for Yates's father, who had been a hard man but not a cruel one, and Henry for Juliana's father, who had dreamed big even if his dreams had never materialized. The baby proved to have his father's blue eyes and his mother's stubborn disposition, crying lustily when hungry or uncomfortable and sleeping like an angel when content. Juliana discovered that motherhood suited her, though it was even more demanding than she had anticipated. The sleepless nights, the constant feeding, the worry that accompanied every small cough or unusual behavior, it all exhausted her in ways that working her father's mind never had. But it also filled her with a fierce love she had not known she was capable of feeling. Yates took to fatherhood with the same steady competence he brought to everything else. He walked the floor with Thomas at night when the baby was fussy, changed diapers without complaint, and looked at his son with such obvious adoration that Juliana fell in love with him all over again. He built a cradle from smooth pine, sanded until there were no rough edges that might scratch tender skin, and installed it beside their bed so Thomas was always within reach. The months after Thomas's birth passed in a blur of feeding schedules and laundry and the slow expansion of their cattle operation. Yates had been carefully building the herd, and by the time Thomas was 6 months old, they had 30 head of their own cattle, a modest start but a promising one. Mr. Anderson had begun discussing the possibility of Yates taking on more responsibility at the ranch, perhaps eventually becoming a partner rather than just an employee. "He is thinking about retiring in a few years," Yates told Juliana one evening while they sat on the porch, Thomas sleeping in his cradle just inside the door. "Wants to move closer to his daughter in Salt Lake City. He has hinted that he might sell me a larger share of the ranch if I am interested." "Are you interested?" Juliana asked, though she thought she knew the answer. "I think so," Yates said slowly. "It would mean more responsibility, longer hours, but also the chance to really build something substantial, to give Thomas opportunities we never had." "Then we should do it," Juliana said decisively. "We have already proven we can work hard. Might as well work hard towards something that will benefit our family for generations." Yates pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "How did I get so lucky as to find you?" "You told me I belonged on flat land," Juliana reminded him, smiling. "And you were right." They celebrated their second wedding anniversary in February 1881, with Thomas now walking unsteadily and chattering in a language only his parents could sometimes decipher. The cabin had expanded to include a proper addition for Thomas's room, and a larger kitchen that could accommodate the cooking Juliana did both for their household and for sale to townspeople who had come to appreciate her baked goods. Life had settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable, even comfortable. Yates worked the cattle and slowly took on more of the ranch's management as Mr. Anderson began stepping back. Juliana managed their household, raised Thomas, and built a small business selling pies and preserves in Park City. They were not wealthy, but they were secure, and that felt like luxury compared to the precarious existence Juliana had known in the mining camps. In summer of that year, Juliana realized she was pregnant again. This time the news came with less fear and more quiet joy, a sense that they were expanding their family in the natural progression of their lives together. Yates was delighted. Thomas was too young to understand but would have a sibling to grow up with. And Mrs. Anderson immediately began knitting tiny blankets with the dedication of a woman who considered their children her honorary grandchildren. The second pregnancy proved easier than the first, perhaps because Juliana knew what to expect, or perhaps because her body had been through the process before. She worked almost until the day she went into labor in March 1882, giving birth to a daughter they named Sarah Jane Granger after both their mothers. Sarah had Juliana's dark hair and what promised to be Yates's serious disposition, though it was early to tell for certain. Thomas, now 2 years old, was fascinated by his new sister, patting her head with careful gentleness and bringing her his favorite toys as offerings. Watching Yates with both children patient with Thomas's endless questions, tender with Sarah's infant needs made Juliana understand how lucky she was to have found this man, this life, this unexpected happiness. The years flowed by like water over stone, each one bringing its own challenges and joys. Thomas grew into a serious boy who loved the horses and followed his father everywhere, learning the cattle business from the time he could walk well enough to trudge through the pastures. Sarah proved to be the wild one, fearless and curious, giving her parents more gray hairs than Thomas ever had. In 1884, Mr. Anderson made good on his hints and sold Yates a 40% share of the ranch, with an option to purchase the remaining 60% when Anderson fully retired. It meant taking on debt, but it also meant stability and ownership, the chance to build something that would outlast them. Juliana handled the business side, her ability to read and calculate making her invaluable in managing the accounts and contracts. By 1886, when Thomas was 6 and Sarah 4, they added another child to their family, a boy they named James Andrew Granger. James had red hair that came from neither parent but that Yates suspected traced back to his mother's Irish ancestors, and a sunny disposition that made everyone smile. The cabin had expanded again to accommodate the growing family, and they had built a proper barn for the horses and a larger bunkhouse for the hands they now employed on their own operation. Juliana sometimes stood on the porch of their home, watching Thomas help Yates with the horses while Sarah and James played in the yard, and marveled at how much her life had changed. The desperate girl who had walked down from the mining camps with nothing but a leather satchel and determination seemed like a different person, though Juliana knew that girl's strength still lived inside her, forming the foundation of everything she had become. Yates would find her during these contemplative moments, sliding an arm around her waist and pulling her close. "What are you thinking?" he would ask, though he probably knew, just remembering, Juliana would say. "And being grateful, me too," Yates would reply. "Every single day." In 1888, Mr. Anderson finally retired fully, moving to Salt Lake City to be near his daughter and her growing family. He sold the remaining share of the ranch to Yates and Juliana for a price that was more than fair, telling them that he would rather see the land in the hands of people who loved it than hold out for the highest bidder. The day the paperwork was finalized, making them full owners of the Anderson Ranch, now renamed the Granger Ranch, Juliana cried happy tears while Yates held her, and the children danced around them, not fully understanding but caught up in their parents' joy. The ranch prospered under their management. Yates had a natural gift for cattle and horses, knowing when to push and when to be patient, and his reputation for honest dealing brought buyers from across Utah and beyond. Juliana's business sense kept them profitable even in lean years, and her insistence on saving for bad times meant They weathered the occasional drought or harsh winter without the desperation that broke other ranchers. Thomas grew into a young man who was the image of his father, steady and hardworking, with a gift for gentling horses that was almost uncanny. Sarah turned out to have a head for numbers that surpassed even her mother's, and by the time she was 12, she was helping manage the ranch accounts. James, the eternal optimist, kept the whole family's spirits up with his jokes and his absolute certainty that everything would work out for the best. In 1892, Juliana gave birth to their fourth and final child, a daughter they named Rose Elizabeth Granger. Rose was a surprise, coming 10 years after James when Juliana had thought her childbearing years were behind her, but she was a welcome one. The older children doted on their baby sister, and Rose grew up surrounded by love and laughter, her childhood secure in ways her parents' childhoods had never been. The years continued their steady march. Thomas married a rancher's daughter from down valley when he was 22, bringing a capable and kind young woman into the family. They built a house on the eastern section of the Granger land and started their own herd, working in partnership with Yates while building toward eventual independence. Sarah shocked everyone by announcing at 18 that she wanted to go to college in Salt Lake City to study accounting, and though it was unusual for a woman, Yates and Juliana supported her ambition, proud of her drive and determination. James took over more of the day-to-day ranch operations, as Yates's back began to protest the years of hard labor, proving that his sunny disposition hid a core of steel when it came to business and management. And Rose, the unexpected blessing, grew into a young woman who combined her mother's practicality with her father's gentleness, equally comfortable delivering a calf or playing piano at church socials. By the time Yates and Juliana celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary in 1904, the ranch had grown to encompass 3,000 acres and supported not only their immediate family, but also Thomas's growing family and the families of the men who worked for them. It was a small empire built on hard work, smart decisions, and the partnership between a cowboy who had seen something special in a desperate girl and the woman who had trusted him enough to come down from the hills. They threw a party for the anniversary, inviting everyone from miles around. Mrs. Anderson came up from Salt Lake City, now in her 80s but still sharp as a tack, and she stood with tears in her eyes as she toasted the couple she had brought together all those years ago. The food was abundant, the music lively, and the speeches both heartfelt and funny, full of stories about the early days when Yates and Juliana were just starting out. Late in the evening, after most of the guests had departed and only family remained, Yates led Juliana outside to the porch where they had spent so many evenings over the years. The stars overhead were the same ones that had witnessed his proposal on that long-ago Christmas Eve, and the land spread out before them was theirs in ways that went beyond legal ownership. No regrets. Yates asked, pulling Juliana into his arms the way he had done thousands of times over their years together. Not a single one, Juliana said honestly. She was 45 years old now, her hair showing silver threads and her face marked by years of sun and wind and laughter. But she felt beautiful in her husband's arms, cherished and valued for everything she was. You gave me exactly the life you promised, solid and lasting, built on love that did not fade. You gave me more than I ever dreamed of asking for, Yates said. A home, a family, a partnership that made me better than I could have been alone. We made each other better, Juliana corrected. That is what partnership means. They stood together under the stars, the sounds of their children and grandchildren drifting out from the house, And Juliana thought about that day in 1878, when she had walked down from the hills with nothing but hope and determination. She thought about the cowboy who had looked at her and seen not desperation but potential, who had offered her not just a job but a future. "I love you, Yates Granger," she said, the words as true as they had been the first time she spoke them. "I love you, Juliana Granger," Yates replied. "From the day you came down from those hills to this moment, and every moment until my last breath." They kissed there on the porch, two people who had taken a chance on each other and built something extraordinary from nothing but will and love, and the shared belief that flat land held more promise than mountain gold. Behind them, their home glowed with lamplight and echoed with the voices of the family they had created together. Before them, the land stretched away to the horizon, fertile and productive, a testament to what could be achieved when two people worked together toward a common dream. The years that followed were gentler, the pace slowing as Yates and Juliana gradually handed over more responsibility to their children. Yates's hair went fully gray, and his joints protested cold mornings, but he still rode out most days to check on the cattle, unable to fully relinquish the work that had defined his life. Juliana's hands developed arthritis that made fine needlework difficult, but she still cooked for the family gatherings that happened every Sunday. Her kitchen filled with children and grandchildren, and the smells of bread and roasting meat. Thomas and his wife had 3 children who were already showing interest in the ranch. Sarah returned from Salt Lake City with a degree, and a husband she had met at school, a lawyer who proved surprisingly adept at ranch life once he got over his initial city-bred awkwardness. James married late but well, bringing home a schoolteacher who civilized him without dimming his essential optimism. And Rose, their baby, married a neighboring rancher's son in a wedding that seemed to unite half the territory. By 1910, the Granger Ranch was one of the most successful operations in Utah, known for quality cattle and honest dealing. Yates served on the Territorial Board of Agriculture, his opinions respected by men half his age. Juliana had published a small cookbook of ranch recipes that sold well in Salt Lake City, and even back east, the proceeds going to fund a school library in Park City. They were not famous, but they were successful in all the ways that mattered, and they had built a legacy that would outlast them. One evening in late summer of 1912, Yates and Juliana sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. They were both in their 50s now, worn but not broken by the years of work, and they held hands with the comfortable intimacy of people who had loved each other for over 3 decades. "You remember what you said to me that first day?" Juliana asked, though she knew Yates would remember. They had recounted the story so many times it had taken on the quality of myth in their family. "I said you belonged on flat land with me," Yates replied, smiling at the memory. "Best thing I ever said, as it turned out." "Best thing I ever heard," Juliana agreed. "Though I did not know it at the time. You took a chance on a cowboy with more confidence than sense," Yates said. "You took a chance on a miner's daughter with nothing but stubbornness and a leather satchel," Juliana countered. "I think we both took risks that paid off beyond imagining." Yates raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles with the same reverence he had shown on their wedding day. "Here is to flat land and the woman who trusted me enough to give it a try. Here is to cowboys who see potential where others see only desperation," Juliana said. "And to building something that lasts." They sat together as the stars emerged one by one, the same stars that had witnessed the beginning of their story and now watched over its continued unfolding. From the house behind them came the sound of laughter, their grandchildren playing some game that involved much shrieking and running. The cattle lowed in the distance, and somewhere a horse whinnied, and the sounds blended into the symphony of a working ranch at peace. Juliana leaned her head on Yates's shoulder, feeling his arm come around her, and knew that she had found exactly what she had been looking for that day. She walked down from the hills, even though she had not known what she was seeking. She had found home, not in a place but in a person, and together they had built something that would echo through the generations. The Granger Ranch continued to thrive and grow, the land carefully managed and the cattle producing strong calves year after year. Thomas took over most of the operations by 1915, allowing Yates to step back and enjoy a semi-retirement that mostly involved advising his son and playing with his grandchildren. Juliana finally stopped taking orders for baked goods, instead focusing on teaching her daughters and daughters-in-law the recipes she had perfected over the years. They traveled a bit, taking a trip to San Francisco that amazed them both with its size and sophistication. They visited Sarah in Salt Lake City regularly, marveling at the growing urban center that seemed so foreign compared to their ranch life. But they always returned to the flat lands of their home with relief, understanding at a cellular level that they belonged exactly where they were. In the spring of 1920, when Yates was 63 and Juliana 61, they hosted a gathering for their 40th wedding anniversary. The celebration was smaller than the 25th, more intimate, with just family and the closest friends who had been part of their journey. The house was full of children and grandchildren, ranging from Thomas's eldest son, now 20 and running his own section of the ranch, to Rose's youngest, barely walking. After the meal, Thomas stood to offer a toast, his face solemn with emotion. "My parents taught me everything I know about ranching, about family, and about building a life worth living. They started with nothing but determination and love, and they built an empire. But more than that, they built a family that knows how to work together, how to support each other, and how to value what matters most." He raised his glass. "To Yates and Juliana Granger, who showed us all how it is done." The toast was echoed by everyone present, and Juliana felt tears slip down her face as she looked around at the faces of the people she loved most in the world. This was what she had walked down from those hills to find, though she had not known it at the time. This abundance of love and legacy, this sense of having mattered, of having built something that would outlast her mortal span. Yates squeezed her hand under the table, and when she looked at him, she saw the same tears in his eyes. "We did good," he whispered. "We did," Juliana agreed. "We did very good indeed." The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and sorrows as all years do. Mrs. Anderson passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1922, and Juliana and Yates made the trip to Salt Lake City for the funeral, honoring the woman who had brought them together and supported them through the early years. They lost friends to age and illness, but they also gained great-grandchildren, the next generation of Grangers who would carry the legacy forward. Yates's health began to fail in his late 60s, his heart not as strong as it had once been. He slowed down further, spending more time in a chair on the porch than on horseback, but he never lost his sharp mind or his gentle humor. Juliana stayed close, reading to him from the newspapers or just sitting in comfortable silence, their hands intertwined as they had been for over 40 years. On a clear October morning in 1925, with the aspens turning gold on the distant mountains and the air crisp with the promise of winter, Yates Granger died peacefully in his sleep. Juliana woke to find him gone, his face relaxed and peaceful, and though grief threatened to drown her, she also felt a strange sense of completion. They had built their life together, raised their family, created their legacy, and now Yates could rest. The funeral was attended by hundreds, people from across Utah who had known Yates or done business with him, all coming to pay their respects to a man who had been universally liked and respected. Juliana stood straight and dry-eyed through the service, supported by her children and grandchildren, and when she spoke, her voice was steady. "Yates Granger was the best man I ever knew," she said simply. He saw potential in a desperate girl from the mining camps and offered her flat land in partnership. He built a life of integrity and hard work, and he loved his family with everything he had. "I will miss him every day for the rest of my life, but I will not regret a single moment we had together. He gave me everything, and I can only hope I gave him as much in return." Juliana lived another 10 years after Yates's death, seeing more grandchildren grow and marry, welcoming more great-grandchildren, and watching the ranch continue to prosper under Thomas's management and James's innovations. She spent her days surrounded by family, telling stories about the early years, about the cowboy who had loved her, and the life they had built together. She kept Yates's wedding ring on a chain around her neck, close to her heart, and she still slept on her side of the bed, the other side left empty out of habit and loyalty. But she was not a tragic widow, lost without her partner. She was a woman who had lived fully and loved deeply, and she faced her remaining years with the same determination that had brought her down from the hills all those decades ago. On a warm May evening in 1935, surrounded by 3 generations of the family she and Yates had created, Juliana Armstrong Granger died peacefully at the age of 76. Her last words, whispered to Rose who sat holding her hand, were simple. "Tell your father I am coming home to the flat lands with him." They buried her next to Yates on a hillside overlooking the ranch, where they could watch over the land they had built together. The headstone was simple, just their names and dates and a single line that Thomas had chosen. Together they built a legacy of love. The Granger Ranch continued for generations after, each new member of the family learning the story of how it all began. How a miner's daughter had walked down from the hills with nothing but hope, and how a cowboy had looked at her and seen everything she could become. How they had trusted each other enough to build a life together, and how that trust had created something that lasted far beyond their mortal years. The story became part of the family mythology, told and retold until it took on the quality of legend. But at its heart, it remained a simple truth. Love and partnership, hard work and determination could build something extraordinary from the most unpromising of beginnings. All it took was 2 people willing to take a chance on each other and the flat land that stretched away to the horizon, full of possibility and promise. And on quiet evenings when the wind whispered through the grass and the stars emerged overhead, those who knew how to listen could almost hear the echo of an old conversation. A cowboy telling a desperate young woman that she belonged on flat land with him, and her brave decision to believe him.